several years, Bill Schneider spoke to anyone who would listen about his involvement with the construction of secret underground bases allegedly used by the United States government to deal with aliens. Schneider accused the government of selling out to alien influences. One of the places where the government is said to have built underground facilities is near Dulce, New Mexico. These underground bases are allegedly shared between humans and aliens and seem to serve their interests more than ours. Some believe the government allows the aliens to abduct people for the purposes of experimentation and study in return for technology. But at this time, these theories are mere speculation. It's interesting to note that a number of unexplained cattle mutilations have occurred in the Dulce area. Such mutilations take place worldwide and are often associated with UFO sightings. During his travels, Bill Schneider was shot on numerous occasions. In 1996, he was found dead in his home, having been tortured and killed. Tubing was wrapped around his neck. Despite this, his death was ruled a suicide. Bill's father worked as a ship's doctor on the USS Eldridge, famous for being involved with the Philadelphia experiment. There are many different interpretations and views of what really happened or didn't when the U.S. Navy embarked on a project to demagnetize warships beginning in 1943. The information that I'm about to provide represents my best guess based on 30 years of research into an experiment that began 60 years ago, and my own encounters with those who claim intimate knowledge about the project. I grew up in the 1960s and first became aware of the Philadelphia experiment when I was just 10 years old. I read a number of nonfiction books about UFOs. The two subjects became linked when Morris K. Jessup wrote a book entitled The Case for the UFO in 1955. After the book was published, a mysterious man who called himself Carlos Miguel Allende wrote to Jessup in the first of a series of rambling correspondences. The letters seemed to indicate that Jessup's call for open discussion and government disclosure of any knowledge about UFOs was a waste of time. According to Allende, there were other forces at work which sought to protect various secrets regarding how UFOs were powered and did the things they did. Although Jessup was not impressed with Allende's letters, he was more than a little surprised after being contacted by 3 naval officers who worked for the Office of Naval Research, the ONR. Although they claimed the contact was not official and made on their own initiative, the officers seemed disturbed by an annotated copy of Jessup's book that the ONR had received. The book had notes scribbled in it by what appeared to be 3 different people, but most now agree it was all the work of Allende. Again, the references seem to indicate that the government had accidentally discovered how UFOs are able to manipulate time and space through a Navy project designed to make ships invisible. After contact with the Navy, Jessup was certain that he had stumbled onto something and thrust all his efforts into finding out what it was. By 1959, Jessup had assembled an impressive portfolio of research into what the U.S. military knew and was hiding from the public about UFOs and the secret Navy experiment. Set to testify about these matters before a Florida senator and several interested parties, Jessup set off to drive from his home in Florida to Washington, D.C. in 1959, but he never made it. Morris K. Jessup was found dead in his car just off of a highway in Dade County, Florida. He had died from exposure to carbon monoxide. Although his death was ruled a suicide, none of his papers or the extensive research he had recently completed was ever located. I read about some of this in a book published in the 1960s by Jessup's friend and colleague, Ivan T. Sanderson. Sanderson wasn't just another author. He was a scientist who believed in the possibility of alien visitations to Earth based on the available evidence. Shortly before Morris Jessup's death, Jessup gave Sanderson a copy of The Case for the UFO, which contained his notes about annotations made by Allende. My own interest in the Navy project might have been satisfied at that point, but for a chance meeting with a former sailor who had been at the Philadelphia Navy shipyard during World War II. In 1973, I visited the family of my best friend's bride-to-be in Florida. We all got together to discuss and further plan for the upcoming wedding. Amy's father was a retired sailor named Joseph. He was a polite but serious individual. During a lighter moment in conversation, I happened to mention the Navy project that I read about and its supposed connection to flying saucers. There had been a number of UFO sightings in Florida during that time, and the topic was on everyone's lips. After dinner, Amy's father sat down across from me while the others muddled through some wedding plans and became very serious. He told me that in 1944 he'd met another sailor who seemed deeply disturbed about the outcome of a strange experiment connected to the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in 1943. The man claimed that his best friend died during the experiment. Joseph and his new acquaintance shared many conversations about it after becoming friends. The man said that after making some casual inquiries, a doctor at the shipyard hospital confided to him that his friend had died as a result of melting into the ship's superstructure. The physician claimed that the man was still alive when they tried to free him from part of the deck, but he had been fused with it. I encouraged Joseph to write down everything he could remember about his conversations with the sailor. He agreed and actually took things a step further. He attempted to contact the man who had befriended so many years before, but hadn't heard from in some time. A mutual friend told him that the sailor had passed away, but provided a contact phone number for his widow. When Joseph called, the woman accepted his condolences, and the two had a brief conversation. It seems that after the sailor retired in the 1960s, he tried contacting others who had been a part of the Navy project to get more information on the death of his friend. But the sailor died a few months later in a hit-and-run accident. This made Joseph think twice about his own investigation of the matter, which ended abruptly after that call. From then on, I began to seriously research the Philadelphia experiment. By the 1980s, a book on the subject had been published by William Moore and Charles Berlitz entitled The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility. The book was the short version of some truth, various theories, and some wild notions by Berlitz. Moore was forced to endure some of the nonsense included in the book by Berlitz in order to get it published. While Moore was new to the publishing world, Charles Berlitz had already written a successful, if not equally vague, book on the Bermuda Triangle. While the Moore and Berlitz book brought attention to the subject, and satisfied those already mildly interested in the subject matter, most of the attention came in the form of scorn and skeptical criticism. Critics pointed to what they felt were a number of glaring errors and historical inaccuracies. Things got worse when a major Hollywood film based on the book was released in 1984. Instead of becoming a documentary-style piece, it was a fictionalized account of the Navy project that turned out to be a sci-fi love story mixed with ridiculous twists and turns. I doubt that anyone, except those with direct involvement, know the truth and entire story of the Philadelphia experiment. But here is my take on what happened. Several young scientists at Princeton University in New Jersey had been working on various physics projects involving time travel, time displacement, and using strong energy fields to move and manipulate objects from a purely theoretical standpoint. This was all done on paper, and nothing could be proved. As World War II began, most knew that the U.S. was secretly trying to develop an atomic weapon that would end the war quickly. Many of the scientists, like Einstein, knew that this was something that was necessary because they felt the Germans might have been doing it also. But they also knew that a weapon like this was not something that could be put back in the box after the war was won. The Navy had their own doubts about the atomic weapon. They were certain that nothing short of a full-scale naval assault on the home islands of Japan would end the war. In the meantime, they faced another problem. The Navy was losing ships to German U-boat attacks and a new type of mine that the Nazis were using, which could attach itself to the hulls of ships by being attracted to them because of their magnetized hulls. They needed to find a way to quickly demagnetize their ships and make them invisible to U-boats and other attack ships and planes. The Navy traditionally degaussed ships in port, but this was a time-consuming method of demagnetizing that was impractical during wartime. They also tried using various exotic paint mixtures designed to refract or redirect light away from their ships, but this still left them visible and vulnerable to Air Force's radar and submarine attack. When the Navy came calling at Princeton, a few young physicists saw an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. They would solve the Navy's little problem, and at the same time test some of their own theories regarding time displacement and using strong energy fields to manipulate matter in a real-world setting. Although his work during World War II remains classified to this day, Albert Einstein was under contract to the Navy during that time. What I've been able to glean from many sources is that Einstein, even though he had once asked Franklin Roosevelt to begin development of an atomic bomb, still preferred the development of defensive weapons, knowing that the atom bomb was something that could ultimately lead to the complete destruction of the human race. Those who agreed with the defensive weapons idea at Princeton were invited to join his efforts. This group of scientists told the Navy that they could make a ship invisible to radar, sonar, and would work on ways to effectively hide it from view. Of course, what they didn't explain was the actual nature of the technology they were planning on using to accomplish these goals. Because it was so close to Princeton, secure, and had ships available for experimentation, the Philadelphia Navy shipyard was chosen as the physical home of the project. The new and not yet commissioned ship, which would eventually be called the USS Eldridge, was chosen as a test craft for the project. Jane's Military, noted for its accuracy, lists the Eldridge as having been launched in June of 1943. The official Navy records list it as having been launched in July of 1943. This easily leaves the window open for the ship to have been used for the initial experiments. The first part of the experimentation took place at the shipyard in 1943 when a powerful energy field was used to instantly degauss the ship without any damage to electronic equipment on board. The vessel also became invisible to radar, but an unexpected and more than welcomed side effect occurred that scientists had hoped for, but the Navy didn't expect. The ship briefly vanished from sight, becoming what the observers had thought was invisible. In reality, the ship had briefly moved to another time and place, having returned when the off-ship field generating equipment was shut down. Some small animals placed on board in cages died after a strange greenish glow encircled the hull just before and after the ship vanished. No humans were on board during that particular test that we know about, and the details of the animal deaths were ignored by naval officials overseeing the project after being told that the fields in use could be adjusted for safety. The experiment moved forward full speed. By 1944, a sea trial was ordered. The Eldridge was manned and surrounded by several other ships. All carried the same technology, with the hope that convoys of radar and sonar invisible ships would pass German U-boats and other enemy craft undetected. But the Eldridge was the only vessel given permission to power up to full field strength on that particular occasion. With many observers, including a merchant marine later known as Carlos Miguel Allende aboard the USS Furiasat, the experiment commenced off the east coast of the United States, somewhere between Long Island and New Jersey. While everyone watched, the Eldridge powered up its field generation equipment. As before, a strange green glow appeared, and the ship began to fade from sight. On board, things started to go badly. Sailors became disoriented, couldn't see, and some were burnt by the green mist. Others faded into the wooden deck and steel superstructure of the ship. Moments after it vanished in 1944, the Eldridge briefly appeared in 1983 off of the coast of Long Island. That occurred because the ship had been pulled through a sort of time displacement wormhole simultaneously created by the 1944 experiment and another one taking place as a follow-up project at a government base thought to be abandoned near Montauk Point in 1983. When the Montauk Base shut down their power in '83, the ship was pulled back through the vortex to 1944 and reappeared seconds after. Upon its return, strange objects were seen above the ship. These may have been UFOs. It's possible and even likely that humans had just discovered how aliens were able to warp and manipulate time and space fields to move about as they liked. But in 1944, humans lacked the technology or computers to control such powerful energy fields. The result was that a third of the crew died, having become a part of the ship's wooden deck and steel superstructure. Many parts of the ship were covered with canvas to conceal the dead before it was allowed to return to the Philadelphia Navy shipyard that night. Those who survived the 1944 sea trial sometimes faded back and forth between time periods. An article in a 1944 edition of the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper stated that during a bar fight at a local dive where sailors and workers from the Navy Yard drank. Two sailors briefly became translucent and even transparent, fading into the rear wall of the bar. Others went insane. By 1945, the Navy had all the remaining sailors from the second part of the Philadelphia experiment, sea trials, locked up in the shipyard hospital's mental ward. What became of them after that, I don't know. While naysayers point out that members of the commissioned Eldridge's crew say none of this ever happened on their watch, most of what happened did so before the ship was commissioned, or possibly during times when a special crew was placed on board for the project. Besides that, the Eldridge was a cookie-cutter ship. There were thousands of ships like it made, and it's likely that one of them could have also been used as part of the experiment. Since we don't have... Although disappointed at some of the results of the sea trials, the Navy realized that it had a new and exciting technology, and they weren't about to let it go. Not only had the project shown them that the use of controlled energy fields could produce the ability to move objects and people rapidly through time and space, but the fields produced an effect on the human mind. After some of the sailors from the 1944 sea trials went insane, the Navy wondered if that effect could be controlled and directed at friendly forces to make them fight fearlessly, or at enemy forces to make them surrender. All these theories would later be tested at what had once been the home of World War II shore batteries, and later a radar facility used to protect coastal areas of North America from incoming bombers or missiles during part of the Cold War. Willing and unwilling participants were apparently brought to the government facility once known as Camp Hero near Montauk Point to test the new technology. Because these tests attracted UFOs, it was no accident that thousands of sightings occurred during the time period when the tests were accomplished. This led some UFO researchers to erroneously conclude that Long Island hosted some sort of base for UFOs, possibly somewhere offshore. Rudder, a popular boating magazine in the 1960s, ran a 1969 article warning boaters that a number of pleasure craft had encountered UFOs off of the Long Island coast near Montauk Point and were unable to restart their engines after these objects moved. Regarding Einstein's possible involvement, he was never actually seen at the shipyard that we know about, but it's possible that his position with the project was more a ceremonial one, allowing the Navy to make use of whatever ideas he cared to input, while other physicists and engineers were given carte blanche on the scene to do whatever was necessary to get the job done. Most of them were young, ambitious, and eager to test their theories in the real world. Today, we may be seeing some of the fruits of the Philadelphia experiment in the form of a growing fleet of advanced ships with stealth capabilities, classified weapon systems, and secret technology. Even a stealth sub is in the works. But was the technology applicable to more than just seagoing vessels? By the time 1966 rolled around, a series of top-secret experiments had been underway for at least 10 years on creating a fleet of truly invisible military aircraft. Faced with the daily embarrassment of advanced aircraft being shot down in Vietnam, President Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Defense, Robert S. McNamara, made a desperate decision. He decided to test a new technology to make large military aircraft invisible. Imagine the advantage of having large military bombers and transport aircraft available to you that were completely invisible. The test would be carried out at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida and would involve a hand-picked crew that had trained for the mission for nearly a year. On a warm summer day in 1966, a C-130 lifted off from the runway at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, preparing to test the nation's newest and most controversial technology. After a few minutes in the air, the crew activated the equipment. This was the first real test of the technology in the aircraft with a crew on board. People on the ground reported seeing the aircraft begin to fade, but also said that strange objects, which looked like UFOs, appeared around it. As with the Philadelphia experiment, the use of technology designed to use the same energy fields that UFOs might use to move about in time and space may have attracted them to the... Seconds after the plane vanished over Florida, it reappeared over Hampton Bays, Virginia. Not knowing what happened, the crew asked for permission to land at the nearby Naval Air Station in Norfolk. Shocked when they were refused, the confused crew decided to land anyway. Once on the ground, they were surrounded by Marines and Shore Patrol personnel. As they attempted to open the huge back door of the aircraft, the crew members were attacked. One of them was shot and killed and fell out of the aircraft. The others closed the plane up and attempted to take off while still being attacked. They had no way of knowing that their little experiment had moved them through time and space from Eglin Air Force Base in Florida in 1966 to Hampton Bays, Virginia in 1982. Because they were using the wrong frequencies and flying an aircraft unknown to the military in 1982, the base took action against what could have been, for all they knew, terrorists trying to land in the midst of an important government area. Once aloft, they turned on the invisibility technology again, hoping to avoid being shot down. Seconds after turning on the special technology, the C-130 vanished over the naval facility and reappeared over Eglin Air Force Base back in 1966. At that point, it collided with a UFO still in the area and began a fast descent to the ground. Just before crashing, one crew member jumped to safety. His name was Robert Marsh, Jr., and that's how I found out about this story. Because he had all the names of those involved, it was easy to verify. The most interesting thing that came out of the entire incident was how a crew member aboard a flight taking off in 1966 from Eglin Air Force Base in Florida can die on that flight, but have a death certificate from 1982 Virginia. Nikola Tesla was an alternative energy genius. Among his inventions were radio-controlled weapons and AC power generators. It was his understanding of powerful energy fields that made him essential to the Philadelphia experiment. Tesla made an announcement in the early part of the 20th century that he had actually made contact with aliens, but few took it seriously. Maybe they should have. Nikola Tesla had a plan to transmit electricity through the air like radio waves. In test after test, his system worked. The power could even be used by totally electric-powered aircraft. But not everyone was happy with the idea. He built a test tower designed to transmit electricity on the north shore of the eastern end of Long Island. At the same time, he had tunnels built throughout the area for support of his energy system. But after Thomas Edison used his influence to convince authorities that Tesla's system was a danger to the public, federal authorities seized and destroyed his equipment. Most believe that those who heavily invested in electric power as an income source were concerned about Tesla's idea to make it available to everyone for free. Despite their falling out, Tesla and the government were said to have worked together on a number of projects, including the Philadelphia experiment. In 1989, I was able to film and question 3 witnesses who also claimed to have been involved with the original Philadelphia experiment and a follow-up project which apparently took place during the 1970s and 80s. The interview and a presentation by them took place at a private home on Long Island and included just a few specially invited guests. Although some of their claims seemed almost insane, I was intrigued. Knowing what the topic would be beforehand, I brought with me a technical writer who had a good understanding of electronics, energy fields, and electrical engineering. I wanted his professional opinion regarding the technical aspects of their information. To make a long story short, he did not sleep for several days after the event, having been completely stunned by what he had heard. I too was shocked by the information that I received from Al Bielek, Preston Nichols, and Duncan Cameron. But being a paranormal researcher with years of experience, I've learned to always look at the bigger picture, not individual stories or pieces of evidence which are always subject to personal interpretation. In this case, it was obvious these men had been through something. They had far too much knowledge and impressively cohesive stories to be faking it, although I did not necessarily agree with all their conclusions. While Al Bielek and Duncan Cameron had been sailors aboard the Eldridge, Preston Nichols had worked at the Montauk Base. All 3 ended up working there on experiments involving time travel and mind control on captured UFO technology and what was developed through the original Philadelphia experiment. It came as no surprise that after I introduced some of the survivors of the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk Project to the world through my video set, The Truth About the Philadelphia Experiment, authorities in charge of the Montauk Base clamped down hard on uninvited visitors. The clamp got even tighter as I added the subject of what had allegedly happened there to my seminar. That seminar brought the story of the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk Project to tens of thousands of people throughout North America via my live seminars and to thousands more on video. The clampdown on already restricted public access to the property was justified by local authorities who claimed that visiting the old base was dangerous. They expressed concern that people might be injured trying to gain access to abandoned buildings or lost in unmapped underground areas. So why leave what they claim is an abandoned base intact in the first place? Why not just go in with bulldozers, explosives, and clear the entire area? Since New York State claims they now own most of the property, why not just clear it and sell the much-desired beachfront land for $1 zillion a square foot to solve all the state budget problems? To put the value of the property into perspective, the sale of all that beachfront land could probably pay for most of the Homeland Security budget for the entire eastern part of the United States for the next 10 years. But it remains unsold, just as the buildings and underground areas remain intact. Why? Camp Hero is the actual designation of what we call the Montauk Base that lies at the far eastern end of Long Island on the South Shore. Although it's just south of the historic Montauk Lighthouse, most people have no idea that this facility even exists. Records are sketchy and mostly unavailable on the property, but it's been owned by or under U.S. government influence for almost 200 years. Once considered strategically important, the base was supposedly closed and abandoned in 1966. It's used as an observation area, port, shore battery installation, and radar facility, the continued use of the property by the federal government was considered unnecessary after another facility took over radar monitoring responsibilities needed for NORAD. At that point, it was turned over to New York State, which has since described it as undeveloped park land. Despite denials from the U.S. government that the base is still a federal facility, it still takes an intervention from a New York State representative or senator to legally visit the property. Once a request has been made by the office of a federal lawmaker on the behalf of a citizen wanting to visit the property, it must be cleared by higher authorities. Who those higher authorities are is unclear. The reason given for this is a small patch of antennas on a tiny hill that is easily visible near the old main entrance to the base. These antennas are used as part of the U.S. Coast Guard communication system and have been for years. Despite the fact that they could have easily been moved elsewhere to a higher and better location at any time, allowing the antennas to remain there gives the federal government a measure of control over the property. That's the enigma of the secrecy that surrounds Montauk. Nothing makes sense about the place and hasn't since the 1960s. I have visited the base on several occasions, spending a considerable amount of time there, and this is no easy task. Men dressed as fishermen regularly walk the perimeter to be sure that no one strolling along the beach or near the lighthouse wanders onto the property. Although they never seem to have any fishing gear or poles, these tall and tough fishermen warn off potential visitors to the base by reminding them that the property is closed to the general public. Each time I visited the base, it was on a major holiday. I knew that there would be few, if any, actual security people on the periphery of the facility. Once inside, I would just have to be extremely careful. On a related note, a four-wheel drive vehicle frantically drove around the base roads after I noticed a surveillance camera staring me in the face at one of the buildings during my first visit. Fortunately, I evaded capture. I visited the Montauk Base seeking to verify two incredible stories. According to witnesses interviewed on my Philadelphia experiment video, which also covers the Montauk Project thoroughly, the base was used as a continuation for government experiments involving time travel and mind control technology, first discovered during the initial endeavor in the 1940s. The huge radar tower was said to be the instrument that directed waves of mind-altering signals out for miles and into towns that surround the base. Despite the fact that the radar dish wasn't supposed to have been used since the 1960s, I found it in remarkably good condition. The electricity in the tall radar building was on, and the restroom was usable. Although the large motors that moved the dish had been disconnected from it and removed, the dish was allowed to sway in the wind to keep it from collapsing. The technology being used for the alleged mind control signal may have been omnidirectional, not requiring the specific movement of the huge dish to a certain bearing. Large numbers of modern-looking wires ran from tubes coming up from the underground into the building and vanished inside its walls. When turned on during the 1980s, the signal would create havoc in surrounding towns. Some of these peaceful places hadn't had any murders or even their own police forces since the Revolutionary War. Although some of the old base houses lie in ruin, many of the offices looked as though they had been recently used. A few actually had working phones. Although many of the buildings looked to be in a sad state of maintenance from the outside, many were in nearly perfect condition inside. Some had lights on and seemed to have been altered for other uses. The inside of the chapel, for example, contained a modern gymnasium. The old PX, seen here, seemed to have become some sort of a kitchen, with hundreds of metal food trays neatly stacked on racks. Other buildings had new fences erected around them, and very modern security cameras, almost hidden from view, were placed in trees, on rooftops, and along walkways. I went during a chilly time of year, and heat freely flowed through an external system that ran to every building. But the biggest surprise of all waited for me in the underground area. Despite the fact that the base was never occupied by more than 60 or 70 people during any of its incarnations, a trip into the underground area revealed hundreds of wooden racks or bunk beds inside a large maze of what seemed like fenced-in and locked areas. It looked almost like a huge base brig or prison, but why so many sleeping areas? The answer might just lie in what the Montauk survivors have claimed. They say that hundreds of people were brought there, against their will, to be part of whatever went on underground. The proof of this seems to be found in the hundreds of sleeping areas and converted PX building where meals for that many people could easily be prepared and delivered to the underground as needed. Another story involving the base was that a large beast, seen on this security camera still, had appeared as a result of underground experiments, gotten loose, and caused external damage above ground. After that, some of the experiments were shut down and the infamous time travel chair removed. I did find some buildings which looked as though they had been attacked and partially destroyed by something big and powerful. Huge holes made it look as if something had punched its way out of the underground tunnels. The remaining tunnels and underground areas were sealed and cemented off where the chair may have been. What took place in the underground area was shocking. One story told to me by Al, Preston, and Duncan was that after Al was placed in the time travel chair, he found himself in the middle of terrible destruction at some future point in New York City. Since much had been done to these people to try and erase what memories they had of the entire project, I wasn't sure if they actually knew when this event would occur. Based on what they said back in 1989, I now believe Al had been transported in time to the year 2001 and the World Trade Center disaster site. The description he gave to me at that time, and that was captured on video, is eerily similar to what Ground Zero looked like after the Trade Center buildings fell. My feelings about this were further confirmed by the fact that he had said he saw the statue of a horse in the midst of the rubble, which didn't make any sense. But then I remembered something. One thing that survived the horrific collapse of the Trade Center buildings was a large sculpture. If a person seeing it was in enough of a disturbed state, it might just look like what Al described, especially given the brainwashing he endured by the government to make him forget the entire incident. It's interesting to note that in 1989, when I asked all three participants in the interview about the incident involving Al and the rubble in New York City, all absolutely refused to comment on it. I felt as though I was walking through a ghost town where the residents had simply vanished or moved underground, but could return at any time to use buildings ready for them. The Montauk survivors believed that the project, in one form or another, was still going on there. While walking on certain parts of the base, I felt a steady thumping under my feet. Given the fact that I had sneakers on and saw no evidence of above-ground construction or a source for the strange vibration, this was more than a little disconcerting. Stooping down to feel the ground with my hands, the thumping was more pronounced. I believe they might have been building new or repairing old underground areas. I visited the Montauk Base with neutral thoughts, neither believing nor disbelieving the incredible claims made about the facility by those who say they survived horrifying ordeals there. My concern was finding evidence to support or refute the claims being made. What I found was a base that seemed abandoned, but also very active. The physical condition of what I examined more than supported at least the background fabric of the stories I was told. If you go to the base today, all the old accesses to the underground areas have been tightly sealed. But there is still access to caves along the beach area, once used by bootleggers during Prohibition to smuggle in illegal booze from offshore boats. Many of these caves connect to tunnels built by Nicola Tesla for experiments with electricity many years ago. These tunnels are separate and apart from the others used for access to the shore batteries and the old fort. It would be easy to use these resources to construct a new and even larger underground area for continued experimentation. Why there? Maybe it's some sort of a vortex. I don't know and can't say. But I do know and now believe that at least part of the truth about what the U.S. government knows or has developed as a result of the Philadelphia experiment and captured alien technology is likely buried under what is still described as undeveloped New York State parkland. Is there really any proof that people have traveled through time? At one point, time travel was thought to be impossible, a mere sci-fi fantasy for idle dreamers to speculate on. But the same may be said of the concepts of manned flight, voyages under the sea, and trips to the moon, which were all once considered the stuff of science fiction novels. The best proof of time travel may be the future knowledge known to a person or people who would not have been able to otherwise obtain it. Jules Verne was one of these people. He predicted deep sea exploration and trips to the moon. In fact, in his book, From the Earth to the Moon, Verne predicted that 3 astronauts would take off in a multi-stage rocket to travel to the moon. H.G. Wells wrote about a time machine in a day when it would have been hard to imagine such a thing. But he also predicted and described the invention of multi-line phones, the computer, fax machines, and portable communication devices. His description of a military tank long before the first one was ever invented and used in World War I left military experts stunned. No less astonishing is this Egyptian carving from the Temple of Abidos. While some Egyptologists feel it is merely a coincidence or recarving of a previously carved hieroglyph, it seems to indicate the presence of a helicopter, jet, spacecraft, and other futuristic machines. And what would be the odds of all these things being on just one panel together if it was a mistake or recarving? Leonardo da Vinci was a man far ahead of his time. Painter, sculptor, inventor, and scholar. Da Vinci came up with ideas, that seems out of sync with the day in which he lived. In a day when manned flight was still a very distant dream, he came up with the idea for a parachute. When travel by sea was still a risky and dangerous venture, Da Vinci invented a diving suit, complete with hoses and a special machine for providing fresh air. While fixed-wing flight was still centuries away, Leonardo already had the idea for a helicopter. Even today, many of Da Vinci's ideas for flying machines boggle the minds of scientists and engineers alike. Perhaps we have to wait a bit longer to understand all the things that he designed. Some may not have been invented yet. In the early 1960s, a painting was discovered in the Palatine Hill area of Rome. It's a place rich with ancient Roman ruins and has been a treasure trove for archaeologists. The painting, dated from ancient times, was a mystery. It seemed to show a very modern building and a rocket ship. Despite all attempts to explain it, the painting remains a mystery. But the scene in the painting is not. It shows a building that exists at the USA spaceport in Florida, along with a Mercury-style rocket and space capsule, complete with the emergency capsule escape jets mounted on top of the space capsule. The question is, how did the unknown artist know about it centuries before America even existed? In August of 2003, Al Bielek, one of the survivors of the Philadelphia experiment and time traveler at Montauk, predicted on a national radio program that there would be a power outage, a major grid outage, somewhere in the United States. It was just a few weeks later that a major power outage throughout the Northeast and parts of the Midwest occurred. Yet people still doubt that our government has been involved in time travel projects. It's hard to imagine the United States government giving up any secrets they know about space travel when they can't even admit to having been visited by extraterrestrial spacecraft. All attempts to get at the answers using the Freedom of Information Act are met by a wall of blacked out papers that are unlikely to hold any real clues to the truth anyway. The more sensitive the document, the more likely it ended up being placed in some officer or government operative's burn bag for ultimate destruction to keep state secrets out of the hands of enemies. We can only hope that if the 20th century will be remembered for being a time when government and military secrets were kept from the people, the 21st century will become best known for being a time during which at least some of the secrets were revealed.